So what does rehabilitation recovery look like in our work, in the work of working with incarcerated people? First of all, it's really important that we place ourselves in the rehabilitation lane, because the so-called mandate of the prison system is to rehabilitate people. Now, how effectively they do that is a whole other question, because most of the focus is still on punishment. However, we have been able to make some progress in certain places, and it's under the banner of rehabilitation. So I like to begin with understanding, what does rehabilitate mean? And in our training that we offer yoga teachers and other people, rehabilitation means to restore to wholeness. And so right away, when you think about, well, what's the intention of yoga? That rehabilitation and yoga go hand in glove, because basically restore to wholeness means to bring a person back into a state of balance or union. The way that we always look at it is that union is a union of the mental, the emotional, and the physical aspects of ourselves. So what we propose in our programs, and particularly when we're speaking with prison administration, is that we bring a body-centered approach to rehabilitation. That most of the rehabilitation programs that exist in incarceration environments are cognitive behavioral. And our understanding, particularly from a trauma-informed perspective, is that only goes so far. And that not involving the body is, you're missing a major part of healing, and you're missing a major part of rehabilitation.
I was just thinking, James, that on the surface, it looks like the populations we work with are so different, incarceration and eating disorders. But if you were to sub out just a few of the words you were using, that is exactly the issue we're working with in the eating disorder space. In the eating disorder space, the word that's used is recovery rather than rehabilitation. But I think that framework you have of restoring to wholeness works. That definition works in terms of recovery as well. I often just, I might use the word recovery sometimes, but I'll say you could substitute that with integrate, make meaning of, heal, all of those words. And I often just say, when I'm working with a client, use the word that feels true for you. What is this path to integration, to healing, to making meaning of? But what really caught me in terms of similarities is that in the eating disorder space, we usually treat eating disorders not in the criminal justice system, but in the medical system and in the psychological therapy system. And the number one treatment for eating disorders is cognitive behavioral therapy. And so I live in the UK now, and we're working with the National Healthcare Service there. And if you look in the NICE guidelines, the clinical guidelines for eating disorders suggest cognitive behavioral therapy. And as of the filming of this, contraindicate yoga. Which they actually warn against yoga. So this is part of our work there, is getting those guidelines changed. So similar, I think recovery for an eating disorder necessarily has to be somatic. It has to come from the body. It has to be that integration of mental, emotional, and physical you talked about. The very nature of the illness is of the body. How can we go from just a mental approach? Not that those approaches don't have utility as well.
Yeah, another dynamic that we see constantly at work around this balancing of the bodily integration with cognitive behavioral is that incarcerated people come to our programs and they discover that beyond the crime that they committed that brought them to prison, that there are many other aspects of themselves. And we talk about, you may be a father, you may be a brother, you may be an uncle, you may be an aunt, you may be a sister, you may be a mother. And there are all these different aspects of yourself. But in the incarceration environment, you're treated as the crime you committed. So you go to cognitive behavioral work, which is important to kind of go back, and the key word is to have insight into, well, how did I commit the crime? How did I adopt criminal behavior as a way to cope? And it's a coping mechanism. Again, it kind of like goes back to some of the things we've been talking about. What are the roots? And the roots are a coping mechanism for survival was I turned to criminal behavior. But that's not who you are. But in the incarceration environment, in the criminal justice system, you are constantly treated for that act that you committed. Whereas in a yoga program, as you're beginning to discover different aspects about yourself, and perhaps you begin to tap into that true sense of freedom of who you really are. Beyond identification with persona, beyond identification with your human history. And so and then you go back into your cognitive behavioral rehabilitation programming, which is like, okay, yeah, I'm the person who committed that crime, and is there ever going to be any hope of me not identifying with that?
Yeah, I'm actually blown away by the parallels happening here, because in the eating disorder space, it's not the identification with the crime, it's the identification with the disorder that often causes a problem over time. So a lot of where I see yoga plugging into traditional or forms of treatment is that it brings that holistic understanding of you're not just a person that has an eating disorder, you're not just an anorexic, you're not just somebody that developed this way of coping, but really from a somatic, from a sensational point of view, from their bodies, starting to tap into that much bigger sense that I couldn't articulate if I tried, of who you are. And, and we're talking yoga in the big Y sense. I think the other thing that occurs to me with that over-identification with the crime and all of that is, the cognitive behavioral approach can be really useful in understanding, okay, how did I develop this way of coping? And also catching the patterns of thinking and patterns of behaviors, those samskaras that keep us identified with the crime, with the disorder, with whatever it is. But the real work of yoga, I think, is developing the observing mind even above all of that. Not just to go, okay, well, that's black and white thinking, or this is all of that, but the ability to watch oneself think, the ability to notice a thought, to know that a thought is just a thought, and that you're not even that thought.
Yeah. And then if you're lucky, if you're fortunate, and speaking for myself and my own path of dedicating myself to yoga, is can I actually at some point in time tap into my true self? And that, without getting lofty, and this is something that we don't really talk about in our classes with incarcerated people, but we see when that happens. And we see that, you talk about people who are incarcerated and their whole motivation is to become free, right? To become out of prison and to gain their freedom again. And when you observe a person realize, oh, my true freedom is in discovering my true self, who I really am, and that the origins of traditional yoga is all about discovering who you really are. Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say, I come back to that term integration and the question we started with, which is what does rehabilitation or recovery look like in those you work with? And it's that you can't define it, but you start to see a person who has integrated all of it, and it's held within that true self. So it's I am a person who has had an eating disorder. I am a person who is in recovery from an eating disorder. I am a person I am all of those things and none of those things at the same time.
Yeah.